So with all that stuff done, it's finally time to try to start the engine. I've gone through and double checked everything is tight, everything looks good, so let's just go ahead and hit the key. So it turns over easily, but it doesn't seem to want to start. You see that? That's an intake backfire blowing through the carburetor. That firmly points a finger at the timing. Now the bigger blowers have pop-off valves or blow-off plates which release the force of a backfire through the intake, but the smaller blowers, or at least this particular one, doesn't have anything like that. So a backfire through the intake, especially a significant one, could be very dangerous and damage the rotors on the supercharger. So I poked around a bit and realized the distributor was actually firing after top dead center. I was pretty confident in how I installed the thing, and I double checked, and indeed it appears to be installed correctly based on the balancer. So I poked around a little bit more, having someone else crank the car while I watched with the timing light, and I realized the rotor was actually firing almost out of phase. Yeah, that's way off. Okay. I didn't even see it. So I messed around with it a bit more and turned it really far advanced. I had to actually move it over a tooth to get it that far advanced, but then it started working. Sort of. The timing just seemed inconsistent, but it did start up. And it started up again. And then I couldn't get it to start anymore. And it backfired again, meaning the timing was messed up, and I had quadruple checked that the spark plug wires were set up correctly. I took the distributor apart again and checked the phasing, which is how the rotor and the reluctor line up with the points on the magnetic pickup wheel, and everything looked okay. And since it's really an amalgam of parts, it becomes difficult to pinpoint exactly what might be wrong. But even after all that work on the distributor, I decided that the best bet would be just to use one out of the box. You guys know from these videos, I don't like giving up on something, but at this point, the car has been dormant for so long, and there are so many variables here, it's just not worth it to me to mess with this distributor right now. I can't find anything wrong with it, but for the sake of time and eliminating some variables to make this thing happen, I ended up getting a new one. Now mind you, I didn't buy an expensive distributor. This is the exact same model that I have in the S10 Blazer, other than it being a little bit cheaper because it's the red model. So yeah, after all that poking with that distributor, there's something funny with it. I really don't know what it is, and at this point I'm just tired of it enough that I want a clean slate and start with a fresh distributor where I can be relatively confident that at least the right parts are in there. So I dropped in this $45 distributor. I'm even leaving the stock springs on this one for the moment. So we set that one up to fire around 10 degrees top dead center, and bam, cranked the engine and it came right to life. This time, the timing was set where it should be. I messed with it for a while, and it seems to idle very well. When checking the total advance, this distributor definitely gives way too much, so we're gonna have to limit the total advance. But another thing I noticed was that at idle, below 700 or 800 RPM, there's a significant rattle coming from the supercharger. First I thought it might be a bearing, and then I sniffed around, and then I was thinking it was maybe backlash in the gears, so I took the supercharger back off. This was actually very easy to do. All I did was hook the carburetor onto the engine crane and slide the supercharger out from under it. A little silly, but it let me remove the supercharger without unhooking everything. So I drained the oil back out of the supercharger and started to remove the snout. I had noticed that the snout was sealed on with RTV, so I had a sneaking suspicion that somebody had taken this thing apart before. And there's the rattle. snout came off with just 6 bolts, and it was easy to feel that the backlash in the gears is not the problem. The backlash on these gears is really minor. So that's not the rattle. There's almost nothing there. The rattle is actually the splines on the coupler mating with the splines on the input shaft. That's what's rattling. I don't see any wear on either of them, so there's not much to be done there, but at least I know what that noise is. I couldn't really find information about this, but in doing some snooping around, I found a picture on the Holley website of a replacement input shaft and coupler, and the splines are much finer than those on my model. In fact, I counted, and theirs have 30 splines where mine only has 15. So it sure seems like these parts are from an older model, and Holley has changed the design in the meantime. What's curious though is there doesn't seem to be any wear on the shaft or the coupler. So as far as I can tell, these parts would have fit like this from the factory. So why would Holley build these with such sloppy tolerances? It might have some design purpose, but it kind of seems like it doesn't, since the later models have finer spines and probably don't have nearly as much slop there? It's hard to say, and for the most part, there's no good way to fix this, other than just replacing the parts with the newer versions. Since that option is not cheap, I'm going to run it as is and just keep a high idle going to try to limit that rattle. So the rattle is occurring at idle because there's a lot of engine vibration being transferred through the drive belt, and that's what's letting the loose splines make the rattle. So with that knowledge in mind, I bolted the coupler back on with some Loctite, put some heavy bearing grease on the splines to try to limit the noise at least, and put everything back together. Instead of using a sealer, I elected to just cut a gasket so that in the future this will be easier to take apart. So with the blower back together, we'll slide it back under the carb, bolt everything back up, refill the supercharger oil, and get back to tuning the engine. After starting the engine a couple of times, I went ahead and changed the oil and the filter. I used the same conventional 10W40 and zinc additive that I had been running in this engine. I messed with the timing a bit, and the engine definitely wants a lot of initial timing. So instead of throwing that in with the existing total timing, I elected to install a mechanical stop. The idea here is very simple. If you look at how the distributor advances timing, what a mechanical stop will be doing is not letting it rotate the rotor as far. So for this kind of stop, what we'll be doing is inserting a screw into this slot and then grinding the head of the screw away to get the exact amount of movement we want, which correlates to the exact amount of mechanical advance that we want. After a couple steps of trial and error, I got it dialed in pretty well, where it's running 14 degrees of initial timing and 16 degrees of mechanical advance for a total of around 30 degrees. I'd like to be running 28 for the sake of safety against detonation, but we'll see if we can get there in the future. For right now, this should be plenty safe. Along with the advanced stop, I installed the strongest springs I have, which are the silver ones out of the HEI curve kit, to make sure the advance doesn't come in too soon. When you're limiting the total amount of advance, you have to remember you're going to hit total timing advance much sooner, since the rotor just isn't rotating as far. But I think these silver springs should put us in a pretty good spot. So it was finally time to put the scoop back on, and that meant I had to modify the linkage for the decorative butterflies for this new setup. The new linkage necessitated cutting a little more off the hood, but no big deal, and we got it sorted out easily. While checking and resetting advanced, I noticed something happening. Above maybe 1200 RPM, the headers would start to glow. A very faint glow at first, but if held at 2000 or 2500 RPM, they would have 6 to 8 inches of tube glowing. Adding the supercharger means there's a lot more heat in the cylinders and a lot more heat coming out of the cylinders. So the exhaust is going to run hotter. That's not a surprise. It just seems like it's a bit too hot. After noticing the red hot headers, I pulled some spark plugs and didn't notice any damage or anything obviously wrong with them. But when I put the inspection camera into the cylinders, there's something different here. The exhaust valves are stark white. They were never this color before, so I wonder if it's due to the heat. I did some research and I actually don't know. There are some people saying overheating can do that, but I also saw a lot of people saying it has to do with the higher octane fuels and the additives they use to get it there. Supposedly, these additives leave this white ashy residue on the exhaust valves. I would love it if somebody in the comments could get back to me about this, but in the meantime, we'll do everything we can to keep those exhaust temperatures down and the headers from glowing. So what would be causing them to get so hot? There are two main culprits, and these are straight from the Holley Supercharger technical manual. The first is timing running too retarded. I can be relatively confident that that isn't the case here because they'll glow red when the timing is at full advance of 30 degrees. The other main cause is running lean. Now, I took a couple steps to try to affect this by putting in the strongest springs and the smallest rods, but it didn't really seem to have an effect. It's still running the 110 jets in the carburetor. According to the Edelbrock carburetor manual, I'm running somewhere around 3 steps rich, but I'm ready to step up to 113 or 116 jets when I call Edelbrock to see what they have to think about this tune. When I get in touch with an Edelbrock tech, he quickly tells me that this is not the right carburetor for this application. This is a 1411 750 CFM carburetor. There is also an Edelbrock 1407 750 CFM carburetor. The Holley Supercharger manual specifies 750 CFM for this supercharger on a 350 engine. So what's the deal? What I had thought is that the 1411 and the 1407 were the same except for the stock jet and rod sizes and the presence of an electric versus manual choke. In the Edelbrock manual, all the other given specs are the same. What this tech told me is basically that the airflow and fuel distribution characteristics are pretty different. And the 1407 is what I would want because it's set up for performance, and the 1411 is set up for fuel economy. With the supercharger, not only are we not looking for fuel economy, but we're definitely not looking for a lean mixture. I still wasn't completely convinced that there was some big design difference that was preventing the carburetor from being correct for this application. A lot of people online seem to think there are no other design differences. I have no idea. So I told him I had a Holley 780, and he told me to use that instead. That's pretty awesome tech support that they care enough about their customers to tell them to use the competitor's product when they think it fits the application better. So if even Edelbrock's tech support is telling me the Holley is a better fit, instead of trying to tune this Edelbrock, which might never be correct for this application, let's drag out the Holley that came with the supercharger and see what we can get done with it. Since this thing was already set up running on this supercharger on a small block Chevy, it should be fairly close in tune. To give the 1411 one last shot, I put the 113 jets in it and ran it. I didn't get the headers to glowing red, but I didn't push it that hard, but they were still pretty quickly climbing to almost 800 degrees Fahrenheit, so I don't think there's a huge difference. There are other things that can cause or exacerbate header heat that aren't as textbook. For one thing, these headers aren't huge. They're 1 5/8 inch tubes, which when you're flowing as much air as a supercharged engine is, might slow down the air coming out of the exhaust, so it's spending more time at the top of the tubes. Sharper bends in the tubes, like the ones coming straight off the cylinder heads, are also slowing things down a bit and therefore will get hotter. Another thing to consider is that I don't even know what brand these are. These were cheap, I got them off of Craigslist, and I have every reason to expect that these tubes are as thin as they could possibly make them. Thin tubes will show the heat sooner, simply because there's less material for it to bring to that temperature before you're seeing it on the outside of the tubes. The smaller amount of material also means the heat won't be distributed over the length of the tubes as well. It will be concentrated towards the head, which is where all the significant glow was. And of course, the last big factor is that the car is sitting still. There's no airflow over any of the exhaust to cool it down. And under normal circumstances, sitting still, it simply wouldn't be held at that kind of speed. But with all those maybes, it would still make me feel better taking the step to put the Holly on here and have a better chance at this working out. So just like the distributor we changed out, yeah, we spent some time and a little bit of money on the Edelbrock, but it's okay. This is a project. It's evolving, and things will change as it progresses. Not everything can go according to plan.